Hey guys, I'm a little bit tired today. I didn't get to come out here and read all weekend, which was sort of what I'd planned for. But that didn't work out. So I am here now, and I'm gonna start reading. But it may be a little bit different feeling type reading because I am so tired. So I think I'm gonna start today with finishing or getting further in at least The Tower of Babylon by Ted Chiang because I like it and it's good to read slow. As they climbed higher up the tower, the sky grew lighter in color until one morning Hilalam awoke and stood at the edge and yelled from shock. What had before seemed a pale sky now appeared to be a white ceiling stretched far above their heads. They were close enough now to perceive the vault of heaven, to see it as a solid carapace enclosing all sky. All of the miners spoke in hushed tones, staring up like idiots, while the tower dwellers laughed at them. As they continued to climb, they were startled at how near they actually were. The blankness of the vault's face had deceived them, making it undetectable until it appeared abruptly, seeming just above their heads. Now, instead of climbing into the sky, they climbed up into a featureless plain that stretched endlessly in all directions. All of Hilalam's senses were disoriented by the sight of it. Sometimes, when he looked at the vault, he felt as if the world had flipped around somehow, and if he lost his footing, he would fall upward to meet it. When the vault did appear to rest above his head, it had an oppressive weight. The vault was a stratum as heavy as the world, yet utterly without support, and he feared what he never had in the mines, that the ceiling would collapse upon him. 2. There were the moments when it appeared as if the vault were a vertical cliff face of unimaginable height rising before him, and the dim earth behind him was another like it, and the tower was a cable stretched taut between the two. Or worst of all, for an instant it seemed as that there was no up and no down, and his body did not know which way it was drawn. It was like fearing the height, but much worse. Often he would wake from an unrestful sleep to find himself sweating and his fingers cramped, trying to clutch the brick floor. Nani and many of the other miners were bleary-eyed too, though no one spoke of what disturbed their sleep. Their ascent grew slower, instead of faster, as their foreman Bali had expected. The sight of the vault inspired unease rather than eagerness. The regular pullers became impatient with them. Hilalam wondered what sort of people were forged by living under such conditions. How did they escape madness? Did they grow accustomed to this? Would the children born under a solid sky scream if they saw the ground beneath their feet? Perhaps men were not meant to live in such a place. If their own natures restrained them from approaching heaven too closely, then men should remain on earth. When they reached the summit of the tower, the disorientation faded, or perhaps they had grown immune. Here, standing upon the square platform on the top, the miners gazed upon the most awesome scene ever glimpsed by men. Far below them lay a tapestry of soil and sea, veiled by mist, rolling out in all directions to the limit of the eye. Just above them hung the roof of the world itself, the absolute upper demarcation of the sky, guaranteeing their vantage point as the highest possible. Here was as much of creation as could be apprehended at once. The priests led a prayer to Yahweh. They gave thanks that they were permitted to see so much, and begged forgiveness for the desire to see more. At the top, the bricks were laid. One could catch the rich, raw smell of tar rising out of the heated cauldrons in which the lumps of bitumen were melted. It was the most earthy odor the miners had smelled in 4 months, and their nostrils were desperate to catch a whiff before it was whipped away by the wind. Here at the summit, where the ooze that once seeped from the earth's cracks now grew solid to hold the bricks in place, the earth was growing a limb to the sky. Here worked the bricklayers, the men smeared with bitumen who mixed the mortar and deftly set the heavy bricks with absolute precision. More than anyone else, these men could not permit themselves to experience dizziness when they saw the vault, for the tower could not vary a finger's width from the vertical. They were nearing the end of their task, finally, and after 4 months of climbing, the miners were ready to begin theirs. The Egyptians arrived shortly afterwards. They were dark of skin and slight of build, and had sparsely bearded chins. They had pulled carts filled with dolerite hammers and bronze tools and wooden wedges. Their foreman was named Senmut, and he conferred with Beli, the Elamites' foreman, on how they would penetrate the vault. The Egyptians built a forge with what they had brought, and as did the Elamites, for recasting the bronze tools that would be blunted during the mining. The vault itself remained just above a man's outstretched fingertips. It felt smooth and cool when one leapt up to touch it. It seemed to be made of fine-grained white granite, unmarred and utterly featureless, and therein lay the problem. Long ago, Yahweh had released the deluge, unleashing the waters from both below and above. The waters of the abyss had burst forth from the springs of the earth, and the waters of heaven had poured through the sluice gates in the vault. Now men saw the vault closely, but there were no sluice gates discernible. They squinted at the surface in all directions, but no openings, no windows, no seams interrupted the granite plain. It seemed that their tower met the vault at a point between any reservoirs, which was fortunate indeed. If a sluice gate had been visible, they would have to risk breaking it open and emptying the reservoir. That would mean rain for Shinar, out of season and heavier than the winter rains. It would cause flooding along the Euphrates. The rain would most likely end when the reservoir was emptied. But there was always the possibility that Yahweh would punish them and continue the rain until the tower fell and Babylon was dissolved into mud. Even though there were no visible gates, a risk still existed. Perhaps the gate had no seams perceptible to mortal eyes, and a huge reservoir lay directly above them. Or perhaps the reservoirs were huge, so that even if the nearest sluice gates were many leagues away, a reservoir still lay above them. There was much debate over how best to proceed. Surely Yahweh will not wash away the tower, argued Kurdusa, one of the bricklayers. If the tower were sacrilege, Yahweh would have destroyed it earlier. Yet in all the centuries we've been working, we have never seen the slightest sign of Yahweh's displeasure. Yahweh will drain any reservoir before we penetrate it. If Yahweh looked upon this venture with such favor, there would already be a stairway ready-made for us in the vault, countered Uludi, an Elamite. Yahweh will neither help nor hinder us. If we penetrate a reservoir, we will face the onrush of its waters. Hilalam could not keep his doubts silent at such a time. And if the waters are endless, he asked, Yahweh may not punish us, but Yahweh may allow us to bring our judgment upon ourselves. Elamite, said Kurdusa, even as a newcomer to the tower, you should have known better than that. We labor for our love of Yahweh. We have done so for all our lives, and so have our fathers for generations back. Men as righteous as we could not be judged harshly. It is true that we work with the purest aims, but that doesn't mean that we have worked wisely. Did men truly choose the correct path when they opted to live their lives away from the soil from which they were shaped? Never has Yahweh said that that choice was proper. Now we stand ready to break open heaven, even when we know that water lies above us. If we are misguided, how can we be sure Yahweh will protect us from our own errors? Hilalam advises caution, and I agree, said Billy. We must ensure that we do not bring a second deluge upon the world, nor even dangerous rains upon Shinar. I have conferred with Senmut of the Egyptians, and he has shown me designs which they have employed to seal the tombs of their kings. I believe their methods can provide us with safety when we begin digging. The priests sacrificed the ox and the goat in a ceremony in which many sacred words were spoken and much incense was burned, and the miners began work. Long before the miners reached the vault, it had been obvious that simple digging with hammers and picks would be impractical. Even if they were tunneling horizontally, they would make no more than 2 fingers' width of progress a day through the granite. Tunneling upward would be far, far slower. Instead, they employed fire setting. With the wood they had brought, a bonfire was built below the chosen point of the vault, and fed steadily for a day. Before the heat of the flames, the stone cracked and spalled. After letting the fire burn out, the miners splashed water on the stone to further the cracking. They could then break the stone into larger pieces, which fell heavily onto the tower. In this manner, they could progress the better part of a cubit for each day the fire burned. The tunnel did not rise straight up, but at the angle a staircase takes, so that they would build a ramp of steps up from the tower to meet it. The fire setting left the walls and floor smooth. The men built a frame of wooden steps underfoot, so they would not slide back down. They used a platform of baked bricks to support the bonfire at the tunnel's end. After the tunnel rose 10 cubits into the vault, they leveled it out and widened it to form a roof. After the miners had removed all the stone that had been weakened by the fire, the Egyptians began work. They used no fire in their quarrying. With only their dolerite balls and hammers, they began to build a sliding door of granite. First, they chipped away stone to cut an immense block of granite out of one wall. Hilalam and the other miners tried to help, but found it very difficult. One did not wear away the stone by grinding, but instead by pounding chips off, using hammer blows of one's strength alone, and lighter or heavier ones would not do. After some weeks, the block was ready. It stood taller than a man, and it was even wider than that. To free it from the floor, they cut slots around the base of the stone and pounded in dry wooden wedges. When they pounded thinner wedges into the first wedges to split them, and poured water into the cracks so that the wood would swell. In a few hours, a crack traveled into the stone, and the block was freed. At the near of the room, on the right-hand side, the miners burned out a narrow, upward-sloping corridor, and in the front of the chamber entrance, they dug a downward-sloping channel into the floor for a cubit. Thus, there was a small, continuous ramp that cut across the floor immediately in front of the entrance, and ended just to its left. On this ramp, the Egyptians loaded the block of granite. They dragged and pushed the block up into the side corridor, where it just barely fit, and propped it in place with a stack of flat mud bricks braced against the bottom of the left wall, like a pillar lying on a ramp. With the sliding stone to hold back the waters, it was safe for the miners to continue tunneling. If they broke into a reservoir, and the waters of heaven began pouring down into the tunnel, they would break the bricks one by one, and the stone would slide down until it rested in the recess of the floor, utterly blocking the doorway. If the waters flooded in with such force that they washed the men out of the tunnels, the mud bricks would gradually dissolve, and again the stone would slide down. The waters would be retained, and the miners could then begin a new tunnel in another direction to avoid the reservoir. The miners again used fire setting to continue the tunnel, beginning at the far end of the room. To aid the circulation of air within the vault, ox hides were stretched on tall frames of wood and placed obliquely on either side of the tunnel entrance at the top of the tower. Thus, the steady wind that blew underneath the vault of heaven was guided upward into the tunnel. It kept the fire blazing, and it cleared the air after the fire was extinguished, so that the miners could dig without breathing smoke. The Egyptians did not stop working once the sliding stone was in place. While the miners swung their picks at the tunnel's end, the Egyptians labored at the task of cutting a stair into the solid stone to replace the wooden steps. This they did with the wooden wedges, and the blocks they removed from the sloping floors left steps in place. Told you I was tired today. Thus the miners worked, extending the tunnel on and on. The tunnel always ascended, though it reversed direction regularly, like a thread in a giant stitch, so that its general path was straight up. They built other sliding door rooms, so that only the uppermost segment of the tunnel would be flooded if they penetrated a reservoir. They cut channels in the vault's surface, from which they hung walkways and platforms. Starting from these platforms, well away from the tower, they dug side tunnels, which joined the main tunnel deep inside. The wind was guided through these to provide ventilation, clearing the smoke from deep inside the tunnel. For years, the labor continued. The pulling crews no longer hauled bricks, but wood and water for the fire setting. People came to inhabit those tunnels just inside the vault's surface, and on the hanging platforms they grew downward-bending vegetables. The miners lived there at the border of heaven. Some married and raised children. Few ever set foot on earth again. With a wet cloth wrapped around his face, Hilalam climbed down from the wooden steps onto stone, having just fed some more wood into the bonfire at the tunnel's end. The fire would continue for many hours, and he would wait for in the lower tunnels where the wind was not thick with smoke. Then there was a distant sound of shattering, and the sound of a mountain of stone being split through, and then a steadily growing roar, and then a torrent of water came rushing down the tunnel. For a moment, Hilalam was frozen in horror. The water, shockingly cold, slammed into his legs, knocking him down. He rose to his feet, gasping for breath, leaning against the current, clutching at the steps. They had hit a reservoir. He had to descend below the highest sliding door before it was closed. His legs wished to leap down the steps, but he knew he couldn't remain on his feet if he did, and being swept down by the raging current would likely batter him to death. Going as fast as he dared, he took the steps one by one. He slipped several times, sliding down as many as a dozen steps each time. The stone steps scraped against his back, but he felt no pain. All the while he was certain the tunnel would collapse and crush him, or else the entire vault would split open, and the sky would gape beneath his feet, and he would fall down to earth amidst the heavenly rain. Yahweh's punishment had come, a second deluge. How much further until he reached the sliding stone? The tunnels seemed to stretch on, and the waters were pouring down even faster now. He was virtually running down these steps. Suddenly, he stumbled and splashed onto water. He had run past the end of the stairs and fallen into the room with the sliding stone, and there was water higher than his knees. He stood up and saw Damkia and Ahuni, two fellow miners, just noticing him. He stood in front of the stone that already blocked the exit. "No," he cried. "They closed it," screamed Damkia. "They did not wait." "Are there others coming?" shouted Ahuni without hope. "We may be able to move the block." "There are no others," answered Hilalam. "Can they push it from the other side?" "They cannot hear us." Ahuni pounded the granite with a hammer, making not a sound against the din of the water. Hilalam looked around the teeny room, only now noticing that an Egyptian floated face down in the water. "He died falling down the stairs," yelled Damikwa. "Is there nothing we can do?" Ahuni looked upward. "Yahweh, spare us!" The three of them stood in the rising water, praying desperately, but Hilalam knew it was in vain. His fate had come at last. Yahweh had not asked men to build the tower or to pierce the vault. The decision to build it belonged to men alone, and they would die in this endeavor just as they did in any of their earthbound tasks. Their righteousness could not save them from the consequences of their deeds. The water reached their chest. "Let us ascend," shouted Hilalam. They climbed the tunnel laboriously against the onrush, as the water rose behind their heels. The few torches illuminating the tunnel had been extinguished, so they ascended in the dark, murmuring prayers that they couldn't hear. The wooden steps at the top of the tunnel had dislodged from their place and were jammed farther down the tunnel. They climbed past them until they reached the smooth stone slope, and there they waited for the water to carry them higher. They waited without words, their prayers exhausted. Halalam imagined that he stood in the black gullet of Yahweh, as the mighty one drank deep of the waters of Halalam imagined that he stood in the black gullet of Yahweh, as the mighty one drank deep of the waters of heaven, ready to swallow the sinners. The water rose and bore them up, until Halalam could reach up with his hands and touch the ceiling. The giant fissure from which the waters gushed forth was right next to him. Only a teeny pocket of air remained. Halalam shouted, "When this chamber is filled, we can swim heavenward." He could not tell if they heard him. He gulped his last breath as the water reached the ceiling and swam up into the fissure. He would die closer to heaven than any men had ever before. The fissure extended for many cubits. As soon as Halalam passed through, the stone stratum slipped from his fingers, and his flailing limbs touched nothing. For a moment, he felt a current carrying him higher, but he was no longer sure. With only blackness around him, he once again felt that horrible vertigo that he had experienced when first approaching the vault. He could not distinguish any directions, not even up or down. He pushed and kicked against the water, but did not know if he had moved. Helpless, he was perhaps floating in still water, perhaps swept furiously by a current. All he felt was numbing cold. Never did he see any light. Was there no surface to this reservoir that he might rise to? Then he was slammed into stone. His hands felt a fissure in the surface. Was he back where he begun? Was he being forced into it, and he had no strength to resist? He was being drawn into the tunnel, and was rattled against its sides. It was incredibly deep, like the longest mine shaft. He felt as if his lungs would burst, but there was still no end to the passage. Finally, his breath would not be held any longer, and it escaped from his lips. He was drowning, and the blackness around him entered his lungs. But suddenly the walls opened out away from him. He was being carried along by a rushing stream of water. He felt air above the water, and then he felt no more. Halalam awoke with his face pressed against wet stone. He could see nothing, but he could feel water near his hands. He rolled over and groaned. His every limb ached. He was naked, and much of his skin was scraped raw or wrinkled from wetness, but he breathed air. Time passed, and finally he could stand. Water flowed rapidly about his ankles. Stepping in one direction, the water deepened. In the other, there was dry stone. Shale, by the feel of it. It was utterly dark, like a mine without torches. With torn fingertips, he felt his way along the floor until it rose up and became a wall. Slowly, like some blind creature, he crawled back and forth. He remembered the water's source, a large opening in the floor. He remembered. He had been spewed up from the reservoir through this hole. He continued crawling for what seemed like hours. If he was in a cavern, it was immense. He found a place where the floor rose in a slope. Was there a passage leading upward? Perhaps it could still take him to heaven. He found a place where the floor rose in a slope. I just read that sentence. Halalam crawled, having no idea how much time passed, not caring that he would never be able to retrace his steps, for he could not return whence he had come. He followed upward tunnels when he found them, downward ones when he had to. Though earlier he had swallowed more water than he would have thought possible, he began to feel thirst and hunger. Eventually, he saw light and raced to the outside. The light made his eyes squeeze close, and he fell to his knees, his fists clenched before his face. Was it the radiance of Yahweh? Could his eyes bear to see it? Moments later, he could open them, and he saw a desert. He had emerged from a cave in the foothills of the mountains, and the rocks and sand stretched to the horizon. Was heaven just like earth? Did Yahweh dwell in a place such as this? Or was this merely another realm within Yahweh's creation, another earth above his own, while Yahweh dwelled still higher? The sun lay near the mountain tops behind his back. Was it rising or falling? Were there days or nights here? Hilalam squinted at the sandy landscape. A line moved along the horizon. Was it a caravan? He ran to it, shouting with his parched throat until his need for breath stopped him. A figure at the end of the caravan saw him and brought the entire line to a stop. Hilalam kept running. The one who had seen him seemed to be a man, not spirit, and was dressed like a desert crosser. He had a water skin ready. Hilalam drank as best he could, panting for breath. Finally, he returned it to the man and gasped, "Where is this place?" Were you attacked by bandits? We are headed to Erech. Sure, that's how that's pronounced. Hilalam stared. "You would deceive me?" he shouted. The man drew back and watched him as if he were mad from the sun. Hilalam saw another man in the caravan walking over to investigate. "Erech is in Shinar." "Yes, it is. Were you not traveling to Shinar?" The other man stood ready with his staff. I was in... Hilalam stopped. "Do you know Babylon?" "Oh, is that your destination? That is north of Erech. It is an easy journey between them." "The tower. Have you heard of it?" "Certainly, the pillar to heaven. It is said that the men at the top are tunneling through the vault to heaven." Hilalam fell to the sand. "Are you unwell?" The two caravan drivers mumbled to each other and went off to confer with the others. Hilalam was not watching them. He was in Shinar. He had returned to the earth. He had climbed above the reservoirs of heaven and arrived back at the earth. Had Yahweh brought him to this place to keep him from reaching further above? Yet Hilalam still hadn't seen any signs, any indication that Yahweh noticed him. He had not experienced any miracle that Yahweh had performed to place him here. As far as he could see, he had merely swum upward from the vault and entered the cavern below. Somehow, the vault of heaven lay beneath the earth. It was as if they lay against each other, though they were separated by many leagues. How could that be? How could such distant places touch? Hilalam's head hurt trying to think about it. And then it came to him. A seal cylinder. When rolled upon a tablet of clay, the carved cylinder left an imprint that formed a picture. Two figures might appear at opposite ends of the tablet, though they stood side by side on the surface of the cylinder. All the world was such a cylinder. Men imagined heaven and earth as the ends of a tablet, with sky and stars stretched between. Yet the world was wrapped around in some fantastic way so that heaven and earth touched. It was clear now why Yahweh had not struck down the tower, had not punished men for wishing to reach beyond the bounds set for them. For the longest journey would merely return them to the place whence they came. Centuries of labor would not reveal to them any more of creation than they already knew. Yet through their endeavor, men would glimpse the unimaginable artistry of Yahweh's work in seeing how ingeniously the world had been constructed. By this construction, Yahweh's work was indicated, and Yahweh's work was concealed. Thus would men know their place. Hilalam rose to his feet, his legs unsteady from awe, and sought out the caravan drivers. He would go back to Babylon. Perhaps he would see Lagudim again. He would send word to those on the tower. He would tell them about the shape of the world. Thank you.